I don't know if we want to redo that part, but maybe we should just say we're joined by Meagan Day, who's a Jacobin contributor and author of After Bernie. We just talked about this.
Bigger than Bernie, how
Bigger
we
than
built the
Bernie.
Sanders campaign to democratic socialism.
Awesome.
For those of you who are listening, if this sounds very weird, it's because I forgot to hit record and we're having to do like a weird little and again. So we're going to be starting the conversation between Meagan Day and Jeremy Johnson. Welcome to Reading Group 2.
Yeah, so welcome, Meagan. It's an honor to be speaking with you. I've been a great appreciator of your work and your thoughts and your analysis, especially last year, as last year was probably one of the most intense periods of many of our lives. And yeah, I was very excited to hear your interest in coming on and speaking about the cosmopolitan socialism angle that Michael Brooks was articulating in his book and then also on his show and probably in conversation. So maybe we can kind of begin loosely with I don't know if this is exactly a question, but does anything kind of spring forward for you in terms of that topic generally, or your conversations with Michael in it? Like, what were the kind of things that he was talking about in 2020 and rebuilding labor, et cetera?
Yeah, so this concept was a work in progress, as I think many of you guys know. Like he sort of named it, and then he sort of because it captured that sort of essence of universalism in the name, and then he continued to like fill it in and relate it to different concepts and current events over time. So I think it was like a living and evolving concept, and I think that it still is a living and evolving concept. And actually, it's up to a lot of people who paid very close attention to Michael and his work and his thoughts to continue fleshing it out. Sort of take the baton and run with it. So I guess I'll start by saying that when I first heard the term, I was maybe a little bit suspicious of the term cosmopolitan, because I think we all have an idea about what that means, and it actually means something that presumably Michael doesn't actually believe in the politics of, which is a sort of like a multicultural liberal capitalism. Like when we hear the word cosmopolitan, I think a lot of times we think about the biggest and most important cities in the world and the kinds of like people who work in politics and finance, who work in the center of those cities and sit around boardroom tables and represent a sort of rainbow of nationalities and the extreme heights of power, right? That's what cosmopolitan denotes to me. I think that Michael actually helped denaturalize that word or the usage of that term a little bit for me. When you really get to the root of it, cosmopolitan means, it's just been bastardized. It means a citizen of the cosmos, a sort of citizen of the universe, a universal citizen, right? And that is why he chose the term cosmopolitan socialism. Because it's not just international socialism in the sense that you have groups of people living in each country who need to sort of organize with people who live in other countries, though that is obviously a constituent part of cosmopolitan socialism. I think that actually it's different. It's bigger than that. Cosmopolitan socialism is an orientation toward the rest of the world, toward all people in the world, that sort of sees people on equal footing. He writes in Against the Web, he has this important quote, an ancient quote, nothing in the world is alien to me. I can't remember who precisely to attribute that to, but I think that captures the spirit of it. Sort of any human in the world is not sort of ultimately a complete foreigner whose experience I can't understand. I'm sorry if you guys are hearing sounds. There's some yard work going on, and that's just happening. So that's the first thing that comes to mind about cosmopolitan socialism, is sort of like understanding what he meant by the term cosmopolitan, a sort of universal citizen. Let's carry the conversation forward. I'm going to mute this, and hopefully that yard work will stop. Go ahead, Jeremy.
That's all good. Yeah, one of our participants, Thomas, says, "Spring is sprung, no worries." Yeah, as somebody who's also a suburban denizen, I'm just like so used to it now. In any kind of podcast, there's always somebody doing lawn work. But yeah, no, I think it took a while for me to kind of warm up to that reclaiming of the term as well. And I think citizen of the cosmos is very poetic. But it's also like, for those of us who are reading Against the Web right now, Michael is very good at expressing and articulating it in a very beautiful spirit towards the end of the book, like when he's talking about building, and I quoted this on Twitter today, building a truly global intellectual and political culture with roots in a diversity of societies. And I think he was really kind of reaching for this sort of post-identity oriented political culture, which could be globally rooted again. And there was a kind of feeling that that had been withdrawing for a while, or that had been captured by, you know, the sort of capitalist neoliberal corporate world, where, like, you know, a Pepsi commercial could be multicultural, but not necessarily a post-capitalist future. So it was really that sense of reclaiming that, I think, which has really stuck with me, rereading the book this time. But
Yeah, I'll add to that that I think one of the concepts that I think is adjacent to cosmopolitan socialism that is was very important to Michael, and I think is really important to me and to many of us, is the idea that it may not be fully possible to understand another person's experience of the world fully, wholly, because we are so fractured and our experiences on this earth as humans are actually so diverse. But it is possible to get closer, and it is actually desirable. And this is something that I think identitarian liberalism has begun to move away from. You do sense that identitarian liberalism, essentialist liberalism, tends to suggest that not only is it impossible for us to understand each other across lines of difference, but it is actually undesirable to try, that you'll do more harm in the attempt than if you simply left it alone. And in that sense, I think a lot of us have noticed that the intellectual scaffolding of that kind of essentialist liberalism ends up at the end of the day looking somewhat similar to a lot of conservative or reactionary thought. I mean, I think usually we tend to like shrug and joke about sort of like neo-segregationism, but there's actually something real and not particularly funny about that. The idea that we should stay separate from one another because our attempts to bridge our divides are actually going to be harmful to one another. It really kind of casts aside the very basis of the idea of solidarity, which is that whatever our differences are, there are commonalities that we can attempt to find, and then we can also try to understand what is different about each other. We can actually attempt to understand that, even if we'll never be able to fully relate, right? So that to me is the kind of, and I think that this is an idea that has actually been maligned in part for good reason, because you do see prior to this contemporary identitarian essentialist liberalism, there was a kind of, and there still is a strain of chauvinism that actually uses the language of universalism to flatten over distinctions and differences and sort of subsume global culture into, you know, Western values and identities. And obviously we want to push back against that, right? It's just that obviously the culture has gone too far and actually insisted that there are things that we can never know about each other, and that we shouldn't even attempt to try to learn about each other and try to come together. I think that Michael was very interested in pushing back on that with the idea of cosmopolitan socialism. And I think partly because the idea needs a defense right now. I think that there are too few people actually rallying to this cause. And I see at least one of Jacobin's sort of political purposes right now is to champion the cause of universalism in a political discourse that's actually pretty hostile to the concept, even if it might claim otherwise.
yeah, to that end, you know, I think many ways Jacobin seems to be implicitly carrying forward the spirit of cosmopolitan socialism, but just in terms of someone or groups that are explicitly doing it, are there examples? Are there concrete examples? Are there works of art or literature or scholarship that you see that's really kind of attempting to articulate that in a more explicit way?
Let's see, I guess I would have to think a little bit harder about art and literature. If anything, I think that this is a live question in the like art and literature world, and those worlds tend to be moving away from this concept. I mean, you could see the most recent sort of debates about whether or not it's possible for somebody who is not Black living in Spain or the Netherlands or some of these other countries to be able to translate Amanda Gorman's work, the poet, African American woman poet Amanda Gorman's work. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this controversy. You could give me like a thumbs up if you know what I'm talking about, so I can get a sense.
I don't. Will you tell me?
Yes. So I'm like not as plugged in as I have been in the past. So I'll just give you like a brief sketch, which is that the celebrated, now brand new sort of on the scene, but celebrated American poet Amanda Gorman's work is being translated into multiple different languages. And many translators have been hired and then summarily dismissed on the basis that they're not Black and therefore can't properly translate her poems. Which is a pretty good example of what we're talking about here, the rejection of the idea that it would be possible to understand another person's context enough if you didn't share some ascriptive identities with them. They're also kind of arbitrary ascriptive identities, because we're taking for granted that it's possible for a person from Spain, for example, to understand an American person's experience well enough to translate, but race itself is a dividing line that apparently is too fixed to be able to cross. And and you've heard some people from the translators themselves who've been fired, have a couple of them have spoken up and said things like, well, I've translated Homer. I mean, I don't think that I had an awful lot in common with him, but I think I did a pretty good job on that. I'm paraphrasing. So obviously in art and literature, I think that this is a really big live question and a problem that's getting worse. I actually think though that it might be getting better in the realm of politics, and maybe not politics writ large. Okay, actually I'll change. But in the realm of like organized socialist politics, I actually think it's getting better. I know it doesn't seem like it if you look online and just look at the squabbling that socialists are doing with each other on Twitter. But having been an active member of Democratic Socialists of America from 2016 to the present, I can tell you that I think that our that organization was more dominated by this kind of insistence that you could never understand anybody who had sort of like basic ascriptive identity differences from you. And that seems to have broken down over time. Not that it's gone. It's not gone, but at least now there's actually like a fair fight between people who think that and then don't think that. Whereas before it did seem like we were just importing hegemonic liberal culture into that organization, and it seemed really hard to make headway and sort of like fly the universalist flag. So it's getting better in some places and worse in some places. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah. I think about this a lot in Hollywood. It's a big problem, and it comes up a lot where creators are both criticized for not being inclusive of other, identities or experiences in their work, but then also really, scolded and ridiculed for, writing a voice or a character that's not their identity or experience.
Yeah, that like Hollywood is another area where I think that it's very live. So the Amanda Gorman example that I just gave, there's a million of those sort of like scandals happening in Hollywood at any given time. I guess I think that what is needed right now from an intellectual perspective is sort of more people to like defend the idea that actually what we have in common is more important than what divides us, which sounds kind of banal. And I actually think that it's been a maligned perspective for a while. Like I remember when I was maybe, like in high school or college, understanding that there were these kinds of like annoying, out of touch white hippies who would say things like, at the end of the day, like we're all from Mother Africa, and you don't want to sound like that person, right? And I remember like constructing my politics to make sure that I didn't sound like that person, because I understood that that was like clearly out of touch and did not understand the sort of realities of racism and imperialism and colonialism, right?
Sure.
And yet you end up throwing out the baby with the bathwater. And this is not just any baby. This is a very significant baby. This is the basis of solidarity, is the idea that actually these divisions that are social constructions that have been sort of concocted to mark differences, perhaps real differences between us, but the sort of like parameters around them are socially constructed, right? The categories that are created out of that difference are socially constructed. That one effect that they have is encouraging us to not see each other as what we really are, which is equals. right? And that like a lot of the socialist projects, certainly for much of the 20th century, was about actually creating new structures in which people could regard each other as equals for the first time. And it reminds me of how, in the USSR, for all of its shortcomings, one thing that I always find really touching is the way that people began to talk to each other. Now it's lampooned and pilloried, the idea that comrade this, comrade that. But at the very beginning, that's actually very beautiful, that an entire country developed the practice of referring to each other as tovarish, your name, tovarish meaning comrade. And what it was meant to do was to enshrine in language the idea that the old hierarchies should be a thing of the past, and that we will all regard each other as individual to individual engaged in a collective project of building a new society together, which is actually very poetic and beautiful. It also reminds me of like in the Spanish Civil War, the sort of anarchist brigades, they didn't use titles to refer to each other. They were all just like soldiers in the army. I myself am not an anarchist, and I see lots of reasons why we ought to have, strong structures and in some cases hierarchies, which makes sense. But like that's the spirit, at least, right? That is the spirit of the socialist project, is a sense of true equality between people, and that what we are driving at is dismantling the kinds of structures that actually keep us from seeing each other as equals. So I think that's one of the major sort of pillars of cosmopolitan socialism, and he does get into that in Against the Web. He doesn't draw it out, like quite to that length, but it seems obvious to me that that was something that he was driving at toward the end of the book. I mean, I don't know if you guys agree. Do you agree?
I do agree. I think that there are many things, both personally and politically, that are devastating about losing Michael when we did. And I think one of the biggest things is he was so focused on developing the idea and flushing it out. And I think that would have been the next book. And that's really where the work was heading. And it was not only about cosmopolitan socialism in terms of embracing the entire globe, but it also was, oh, this is kind of a weird flip, but also how do we do that internally? Like, I think that's kind of why the spiritual was part of it. It was like, how do we become whole, see each other all as human and full and complex, and embrace that and have camaraderie? And then also, how do you do that within yourself? The more informed you are, the more you read, the more you look at things, it does come with a certain amount of pain, like shutting yourself off to it gives you this amount of fortitude of just not having to take so much in. And so I think Michael was focused on how do we connect globally, and how do we fortify ourselves to continue to be able to have the empathy. Like, I know this sounds really strange, but I think I was actually texting maybe with Jeremy. I could, but someone, it was right around when this horrible shooting happened, believe it or not, 2 shootings ago now in our, horrific news cycle. And I said, I'm amazed and still am moved to tears and shaken by these events, because you'd think at this point I would just be completely a zombie. But how do I continue to take that and want to, not just get burned out as just a person that has this empathy. So anyway, sorry to digress, but that's kind of the full answer, I think, was that he would have wanted to move forward on that, and kind of in 2 lanes that were connected.
Yeah. I don't know if that was with me, Lisha, but I was thinking along the same lines, like we're going back to normal and the COVID rates are dropping, and like, but what's normal? Like, what are we going back to? We're going back to, oh, okay, weekly shootings again in public spaces. Great.
Yeah.
So I think that distanciation from that for a while and having that break and coming back to it is kind of a shock to the system. And it's like, oh, okay, our society was really broken before all of this happened. And it's very clear now, like even more so perhaps than before, when we were kind of like the frog in the boiling water and not really recognizing what was going on around us. But to answer Megan's question, just in terms of my own take, yes, I think that was really clear. And I think I mentioned this in the last session, like when I had a chat with Michael about the book, the only thing he wanted to talk about was the last chapter and what I thought about it, and like where he wanted to go with it next, and how to unpack it more. So I definitely think that was the core of the book. Really, that was the spirit of the book, and really where he wanted to go. But yeah, I mean, like even the line we mentioned last time too with Luke about, an integral approach like a la Gramsci, right? With like criticism, art, movement building. You mentioned language to call each other in a non-hierarchical way. Like these are really powerful expressions of a new way of relating to one another. So how do we, I don't know, I don't want my question to be too grandiose, but how do we continue that not only individually in terms of like Lisha was mentioning spiritual practices, but like if this is a political project, what do we do as like the TMBS community, as individuals, as people situated in different areas of the world? Like where should we begin besides reading books, which I think is a good start, but
I mean, I think that we need to work on a new way of interacting with one another. And like, I have long thought, and I actually haven't asked anybody about this. I never got to ask Michael about this. Like that against the web obviously is against the IDW, right? But the last chapter sort of gives a second meaning to against the web, because he doesn't go into it in depth, but I'm sure he would have, and he was talking about it on Twitter, and he's talking about it in conversation with people. I mean, social media really makes these things worse. I mean, it's not a coincidence that there's this rise of sort of siloed emphasis on ascriptive identity and difference, and at the same time that there's a rise in social media, and with it, you know, social media outrage brigades and sort of the cheap easy points that you can score by pointing out that someone has been problematic, and so on. You know, I think of a lot of I think of this last chapter actually, and actually because he mentions Mark Fisher elsewhere in the book as well, as a little bit of like a continuation of the thesis that was first advanced by Mark Fisher in Exiting the Vampire's Castle, which I assume all of you have read by this point. I loved that essay. I didn't read it when it came out. I read it a couple of years later, when I really needed to read it. I mean, I was like desperate. It was like a cool drink of water in a desert, you know. But I do think that sometimes the lesson of it is forgotten, which is that some people who also love that essay actually love it because it takes down their sort of like woke opponents very deftly. And I'm not going to lie, I think that it very deftly does exactly that. But that's not the value of the essay. The value of the essay is that it demonstrates that that's not an appropriate way for us to relate to each other, and it's not going to set us up for actual victory as a left, right? So the actual title of the essay is not "What's Wrong with the Vampire's Castle?" It's "Exiting the Vampire's Castle."
Right.
So he describes the vampires in the vampire's castle and what they are like and what it's like to be in the castle. But then the rest of the very last part of that essay is about building a new culture of solidarity, where I believe, as he puts it, we don't do capital's work for it by abusing each other into like acquiescence and silence, right?
Yeah.
I'm paraphrasing, but I think that's more or less what he says. And I think that this last chapter of Against the Web carries that same sort of spirit with it. I mean, he doesn't say so explicitly. I think he probably would have wanted to talk about this more in the future, because he was like, I remember he was tweeting about it like in over the summer when things were, when there were these like incredible, beautiful, moving upsurges of public protests and unrest, and then you would look online and people would just be savaging each other for not reacting to them properly. People who were all in support of them and in the general spirit of them were sort of just like destroying each other in their off hours, right?
Wow.
I guess so. I don't think we're all going to run around and start calling each other Tovarish, right? But what is a cognate for us? Like, what would be the appropriate intervention for us, given that we don't live in an incredibly hierarchical society where people are actually referred to by their titles that designate their class location? Maybe just learning how to use social media better. Like maybe that's actually something that can be like our cognate as given where we're at and given some of our problems, because I do think that we have an abusive relationship to social media as a culture, as a left. And I think that it exaggerates and exacerbates the worst, most just ugliest and most unappealing tendencies, cultural tendencies of the left. And so I think it's our responsibility as a sort of like, I don't know, a brigade of like people who think long and hard about these questions to like model a different way to exist online. Online is a gift. It allows us to find each other, to talk to each other about politics. It's where I started to get my wheels turning. I'm sure that is true for many of you. But we need to like probably demonstrate what it looks like to actually engage in good faith and to not just like play the internet point scoring game in a way that is like um, not only abusive to each other but to our movement, right?
Yeah. I really love that because I Michael was so over the internet. I think he was probably close to like deleting Twitter. Like it just had gotten so toxic. He just like it was like constantly a thing where I think he would have stopped using it. But I always go back and forth because I, like you just articulated so clearly, it is so much like I don't want to I don't know. I know Twitter is a very small amount of the population, blah, 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 but the social media has given us this power and this infrastructure, and it is something. Like, it's not nothing. You can't just completely dismiss it. And so I like the idea of like etiquette or shifting the way you use it in like Buddhist meditation circles that Michael and I grew up around. It's like right is kind of the word you use. Like right sexuality would be like being sexual and dating people, but not being like a psychopath. So, it's like right internet use. There's something I think so doable in that. And also I think would make a huge difference. And also remembering that people don't just live on the internet. Someone said that to me recently. I was talking about someone and I was like, yeah, that's really intense. And he was like, you have to remember that they live on the internet. I was like, oh yeah, like they're just always on Twitter and doing their stuff and they're not really outside and talking with people. And that was a good reminder to not live on the internet.
I just
Yeah,
dropped a
Meagan,
little
I saw
link
you.
in the
Mhm.
side. Yeah, well, just because I mean, I don't even know if I agree with all of this anymore. It looks like I wrote it in 2018, which is a long time ago. A lot has happened since then on the internet, you may have noticed. But I wrote an article called Unfortunately We Can't Log Off, which is a response to an article that was written saying that we should log off, which I actually agree with. Like, I think that if it would be better if we could just log off, but I actually
Yeah.
understand that we need to make use of the gifts of interconnectivity in order to advance our politics. We just like have to.
Mhm.
But given that the internet is like, I mean, again, to speak of not coincidences, it's not a coincidence that Mark Fisher's Exiting the Vampire Castle essay came out in 2013 when like these kinds of uses and abuses of social media were actually like they were kind of newer. Like they like, Twitter had just kind of fired up and people had started to like really use it to divide themselves into camps and then like shoot, like from their camp into the other camp. And it had just started to get really nasty. And so I guess I've lost my train of thought slightly, but I will say that this article is my way of trying to say that I think that we have to use the internet in order to advance our politics, but I think that we need to also exit the vampire castle. It's really hard. It's like kind of an individual process. Like every individual person needs to figure out what makes sense for them in terms of using the internet. Some people on this call probably don't even like tweet or anything. And I think that that's great. And you're under no obligation to. I feel as a writer for Jacobin that I do have to maintain an online presence. Otherwise, I'm just like, it's a wasted opportunity. But it has been bad for my mental health on occasion. It has been very distracting. It has been deforming to my politics on occasion. I will freely admit that there have been times when I have become fixated on an opponent who did me wrong or said something wrong, have built a narrative where actually the kind of politics that they represent is a unique threat, perhaps more important than the other types of politics where I'm not interacting with anybody, right? And usually it just gets closer and closer and closer to wherever you are. So it's just like someone who's quite close to you, but a little bit different, is the person that you end up focusing on being the worst problem. So that can be deforming to your politics in that way. And you really have to steel against it and guard against it. I talked about this with Michael, and actually Michael was very sweet to me. He could see whenever I was like getting just like put through the fucking ringer on Twitter, I would like get nice messages from him telling me to like keep my chin up. But I also, what he didn't say, but what I think probably is true is that like keep your chin up, but also like don't let this shit like it colonize your brain. You have other stuff to do. We're all far too important, right?
Yeah. I can so relate to that. The closer that it gets, I feel like the people I've fixated the most on are just like basically me, but like neoliberal, like centrists. Like
It does seem like there must be like Lisha, you were mentioning like right action, right speech, right livelihood in Buddhism. Like I don't, in that double bind of not really being able to get offline, like how do we stay online but use online to really kind of ground ourselves in material politics and what's happening on the ground, right? Like, because that was what like Michael was talking about so much after Bernie lost, which is like, okay, we need to focus on rebuilding labor. And that was just what he was always hammering home. And I'm even thinking about like in relation to like the Amber Frost article on Catalyst talking about the poison chalice of hashtag activism.
Mm.
And I'm wondering if Meagan, if you read that article and how you think that kind of relates to your earlier article on staying online, right? Because part of her thesis in that piece was kind of like, to the extent that we do stay online, it should be to get us involved in politics on the ground.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. Except for, okay, I think I agree that our engagement online should be oriented toward getting people to engage in politics offline. But I don't think that it should be, not that she's saying this by the way at all. But I just think that to draw a distinction, I think that we it can't just be like tweets about meetings that people should go to. Like I actually do think it's important to build an online culture that represents our politics. It's just that that culture should be pointed outward. It should be pointed offline. Like the purpose of the culture should, everyone in the culture should understand that online is not where the magic happens, right? But you do have to like participate in debates, you know, and like I know that at least when I'm speaking just about the messy process of my own political development, certainly at the beginning, it wasn't all just like noble messages that reached me and changed my mind. Frankly, it was like it was like the Chapo guys dunking on dumb liberals and me being like, they are correct, I agree with them, and like hitting fave, you know. And that's not exactly like lofty or noble, is it? But it actually ultimately did lead me offline, and it led me into the world not only of like IRL socialist politics, but it led me to a position where, I mean, I consider my entire life essentially to be devoted to building the socialist movement, and that's where it started. So I do think we need to maintain some kind of presence, and it can't be entirely formal. You know what I mean? Like I think it's okay to have online culture. We just The main thing that I think is that I just think that we can't abuse each other. I'm sorry if I'm overusing this term abuse. I just think that um, we should try to figure out where the dividing line is. It may be somewhat arbitrary between us and people who are actually hostile to our entire project, to even the very basis and premises of our project. And if somebody is generally in the tent, I think the disagreements that we have should be in good faith. And I'm not just saying that you shouldn't savage people. I mean, I think that also you should think twice before you lightly ridicule someone who you think is like generally acting in good faith. It's not always easy, but I think it's important actually. I mean, I think we'll fare a lot better if we can all try to have a little bit more self-discipline in this regard. But yes, we should be pointing offline always, because online is structured such that it will naturally enhance the worst features of the left to begin with. So the left has always been plagued with sectarianism. It has always been plagued with a kind of like moralism. I mean, the reason why the left is plagued with moralism is because it is the morally correct position to take. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like people who come to the left are people who have decided, they've looked around them and they have seen the injustice and inequality and the like degrading poverty of the world and oppression and repression, and then they've decided that they can't possibly bear it, and so they need to be a part of some kind of project of ending it. So your people are walking in the door with some like pretty intense feelings, some pretty intense moral feelings. It self-selects for certain types. People sort of like develop certain attitudes, especially when they're going through their conversion process to the left, and they bring those attitudes with them in the door. You know, there's lots of reasons why the left is plagued with moralism. That's always been the case. I mean, that's just always been the case. It is made significantly worse when you have technology that allows you to provide instant evaluative feedback to every single person who is speaking at any given time. And it's like very low effort, and you can do it in a really high volume, and you face very little accountability for saying things that you would never say in person. So I think that we should be judicious about the way that we use social media. But I don't think that we should shy away from like finding each other online. And in order to find each other, I think that we have to have fun and
Yeah.
and speak the truth, right? Like there are, I think that was what really drew me to the left initially, was seeing people who very clearly were speaking the truth, and not just sort of formally inviting me to come to a socialist meeting, but really actually like pointing out what a ridiculous and awful society we live in.
Yeah. I think the socialist movement has become a more fun space. I went to my first meeting when I was 13 or 14 and I didn't stay involved. And I remember it being very somber and kind of like an AA meeting. And it was like, folding chairs in like a rec center with like, mostly I think like 10 white guys and me, it was like really somber. Jeremy, did you want to ask Megan any other questions, or should we open up to kind of hearing other people's thoughts about cosmopolitan socialism?
I was just gonna say, I think Megan already saw it. Thomas was like, "So you're saying it's still okay to cyberbully Andrew Sullivan?" So, um, no,
Yeah.
I don't think. Yeah, I mean, I think we had a good round of questions and explored this topic. Unless you had any other comments on cosmopolitan socialism you wanted to squeeze in.
Yeah, I mean, I think we drifted a little bit from the meaning of it, so I just want to kind of reiterate what I think is the real meaning of it. Like if I could just sort of in a nutshell say what I think cosmopolitan socialism is, it's an embrace of the idea that our commonalities are actually more important than our differences. It doesn't reject the reality of our differences, but it seeks common ground. And the reason why I think that's important is because I think I mentioned this earlier. I feel like that kind of attitude has been dismissed as being either, on the one hand, very Pollyanna-ish, and kind of oblivious, or on the other hand, actually kind of insidious, because you must be smuggling in some kind of like dominant chauvinist narrative and pretending that you actually care about a diversity that you don't, right? But it may sound banal to us, but I really think that that's the crux of it, because if you don't actually think that people can imagine each other's inner worlds, then I don't know how you would go about building solidarity in the real world, right? Because that's the basis of it. And I guess I want to also draw our attention to something that's in Against the Web, when he sort of cites M.N. Roy, talking about the Second Congress of the Communist International. And Roy says, for the first time, brown and yellow men met with white men who were not overbearing imperialists, but friends and comrades. And that is the goal, right? I mean, like, it doesn't deny the fact that racism and colonialism and imperialism have left very real legacies of difference and inequality. But the goal is actually for us to all come together across our differences and to see each other as like comrades, as tovarish, as people who are on even footing with one another. And this idea deserves some champions, because it's been dismissed. Obviously the right dismisses it because they defend traditional hierarchies. They actually think that you need to open your eyes and just like stop being PC and just see that the traditional hierarchies are there for a reason, and stop trying to repress them because they represent something true and real, right? Obviously we reject that. But I feel that liberal essentialists are have a very dismissive attitude toward this idea that we ought to regard each other as equals, and that we ought to seek to understand each other's circumstances, and that it might not be fully possible, but it's more possible than if we didn't try. If that makes sense. So that's what I think is the real like spirit animating the idea of cosmopolitan socialism.
That was beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Megan. Yeah, let's open it up to questions.
Yeah, I would love to hear. Let me see if I can do this. All right, let's see. I'll unpin us. I think that's what I have to do. Yeah, I would just love to hear what other people's how they interpret the idea of cosmopolitan socialism. View and gallery. All right, there we are. Hi, welcome everyone. Can everyone see? Okay, good. Yeah. So, and also, if you had a thought about any of the other kind of conversation topics we hit upon, you don't have to feel like it. You only can respond to cosmopolitan socialism. I feel like such a teacher power right now.
I actually kind of feel like a student in this moment right now. I kind of my hand just now. I'm not sure if you saw that.
Sorry, I didn't.
No, it's okay. It's okay. Just pretend it didn't happen. But I'm more interested in asking a question rather than responding. So, just from each of you, I'm curious to see how you think we could introduce that into the discourse, the idea of using the term cosmopolitan socialism. Like, how do you go about making that more of a mainstream, or not mainstream, but more of a talking point amongst the left?
It's a really good question. I mean, I have been away from my normal work duties due to a family matter, and during the last several months that's been happening, I've been thinking about like how I want to return, because to be honest, after Bernie I was just kind of running on fumes and like doing my best to like keep up with the news cycle and wasn't thinking super critically about like what I wanted to do politically to interject in the debate, the discourse, whatever. And I have thought that I want to actually just on a very simple level, I just would like to use the term cosmopolitan socialism more. I mean, I think that if we use it, it might catch on. It's a pretty good term. Cosmopolitan socialism demands that we X. We could just sort of use it as though everyone knows what it is. I think it might catch on. I have also thought that, in keeping with the comments that I've made here tonight, that we should be making more overt defenses of universalism. It might seem obvious. Some of the points might seem obvious to us, but clearly they're not. I mean, clearly, like if you have let's think back to the Amanda Gorman controversy that I just shared at the top of the segment. I mean, clearly large numbers of people with a great deal of influence believe that we are so different from one another that we can't possibly understand each other's emotional landscapes, that our ascriptive identities must render our thoughts completely unintelligible to one another. That's not healthy for large numbers of people to actually genuinely believe. It actually is a valve that opens directly into the right. So I think that we should be mounting a principled defense of universalism in general. And you can do that in a couple of different ways. One, you can just sort of like do it out of the blue. Like maybe when I come back, I'll write like a 700-word piece for Jacobin that just is called "In Defense of Universalism," like for no good reason, right? Or, I mean, I have tried in the past to peg it to current events, and I think that this is something that everybody can do, not just people who like have a platform like mine. Is like just talk about it in relation to current events. Most of all, I think we need to embrace it amongst ourselves. I think we need to understand that we actually have a problem right now, which is that like universalism is maligned, and that when universalism is maligned, the basis of solidarity is badly eroded intellectually. And so if we admit to ourselves that we have this problem, then we can take it as a political project to try to rectify this problem by interjecting appropriately, and probably like topically, I think. So for example, I wrote a piece that I remember actually Michael said that he liked it, which always meant a lot to me when Michael said that. I wrote a piece called Unions are important for eliminating racism, something very, very like basic like that. And it sort of told the story of when Black dock workers and white dock workers in New Orleans found that when they kept separate unions and they kept to themselves, the bosses, if one of them would go on strike, the bosses would simply use the other group as scabs. And so despite the white dock workers' racism, the white dock workers realized that it was in their own self-interest to unite with the Black unions and go on strike together instead of going on strike separately. And that this created the precondition for a relaxing of racial prejudice actually among those white dock workers. And there are lots of stories about this. In fact, the white dock workers demanded thereafter that that groups of workers on the docks, that shifts be half Black and half white. They called it the half and half policy, because they realized that racial integration was like necessary for them to all achieve, like real material gains together. And this was, of course, enormously threatening to the Jim Crow system. And you can read all about that in the article that I wrote. But, you know, I took the occasion to sort of like make the point that when people fight together for the things that they all need, because we all have things that we all need a roof over our head, we all need things to eat, we all need meaningful work, we all need to have a degree of self-determination, we all need to have a degree of autonomy, we need to have meaningful family lives, we need a voice in our democracy. And when we fight together for these things, we will discover that what we thought were the highest fences separating us were actually like total illusions, right? And actually, and then you'll see in the article that I wrote, and I'll drop the link here in a second, that I cite a study that actually found that union membership does relax racial prejudice among white workers in the United States today. I think that that's the reason. So that's all a very long-winded way to say that I think that you can sort of find occasions to make this point wherever possible. Again, not all of you guys like write articles, and you're under no obligation to write articles, but you have people that you talk to, you know, you have like conversations, ongoing conversations with people who respect you. And I think that mounting a principled defense of universalism is a major task ahead of us.
Great question. Also nice to meet you, Jay. We've DM'd. I don't always remember people's names and handles. So if I've also messaged with anyone else here, what's up?
Yeah, thank you, Megan. I was going to mention too, something Jane McAlevey has brought up very frequently, examples like that, anecdotal examples where she's working and there's some kind of racial prejudice, which is massaged through union work. So would you say like a refinement of that question, like, yeah, share this kind of knowledge with friends and family, but also share the stories, right? Like where there are stories, can we pass those stories around? Because that's, I think, part of the way we can rebuild culture in a different attitude.
I agree. And speaking of this, it looks like somebody in the chat actually has a story to share, which I would very much like to hear.
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
Can you guys, sorry, can you guys hear me all right?
Perfect.
Oh, cool. So I live in Richmond, Virginia, and one of the more incredible things, I mean, it's a trend, I think, across the whole country, but our school system here is like pretty segregated, as are most urban school systems, although Richmond is like a majority minority city. But it's weird, like we had the teacher of the year from Richmond in, I think, 2019. I think it was before the pandemic. And he's kind of become like a thought leader. He got like a high paying job with the city's education department. But he was saying something along the lines of, because there's so much inequality in our school system, where the average school, public school in our city is like 80% Black, despite the fact the city's 50% Black, it just doesn't make sense. It's people going to private school, really. And he was saying that the solution to this problem was to accept it as a norm, to surrender completely on the problem of segregation reoccurring in the city. And since white teachers are statistically proven to have worse like disciplinary outcomes with Black students, to only to seek to have a goal of basically 100% Black teachers in the school system, which sounds pretty Nazi to me, like, because the obvious conclusion to that is you have white teachers for the white kids and you have Black teachers for the Black kids. And my brother and his wife both teach in the school system. And it's something that they can't even talk about with their coworkers, because it's like completely taboo to object to something like this. And it's completely counter solidarity. It's completely counter to everything that we're talking about, that this is the suggestion, but this is what's coming from like the Black liberal leadership class. And it's insane to me that this is what people are thinking is the norm. And I think there is some inroads to have this conversation, but I think, to be honest, the main resistance to it is the white liberal class that are my brother's coworkers, who are essentially ready to surrender their jobs because they think that they're, like constitutionally unable as white people to teach Black kids. I don't know if you guys can comment on that, but it's kind of, I think it definitely is in the same vein of the conversation that you've been having tonight.
I do want to comment on this because yes, that's very much in the same vein, and I think that it's like a even more egregious example in some ways than the Amanda Gorman thing. And the reason I say that is because like the Amanda Gorman thing is really kind of like an intra-elite conflict, to be honest, and this is something that really impacts working people and their families. And so you do see that this is not confined. This is something actually, and this is a myth that we need to bust, is that the idea that this is confined to like PMC culture or whatever. The truth is that it's not actually. It's like pretty pervasive. I mean, depending on how you consider teachers, right? But I consider teachers to be workers. My partner is a teacher and she works really fucking hard. So, but yeah, she went to education school. She went to grad school to get her master's in education. And she was on a number of occasions, it was suggested to her that she should try to find a mostly white school to teach in because she would do more harm than good if she were to teach Black and brown children, which is pretty disturbing if you think about it, because again, this is sort of emphasizing very arbitrarily differences over commonalities. So for example, commonalities might be that humans have the ability to do math. And like, you know, and as a teacher, she, as an older person, an older human who knows more about doing math, could be able to impart that universal knowledge to a young Black or brown student. Why that would be like immaterial, and the idea that she would like microaggress against her students is like very material, is like completely arbitrary to me. But it does seem to, it's a good example of that kind of like pushback against universalism and the very troubling sort of embrace of segregation, and not just like, you know, like sort of, I mean, de facto segregation, and also just like even intentional segregation for the well-being of marginalized people, which is only going to reinscribe racial ideology. And as I said before, is a valve to the right, because the purpose of integration is to not only to improve life outcomes for people of color, but it's also to impress upon white people that people of color are in fact people, and that are the same type of entity as themselves, and also to impress upon people of color that white people are also just in fact people and are not like they don't have like, there's the only if they're further up the ladder, it's because of some sort of structural reason, not because they actually have separate properties that put them there, right? So this is actually an anti-racist program. That's the reason why anti-racist activists throughout the 20th century fought so hard for integration. And I think that we need to be, unfortunately, it's like very sad, but I think there are situations in which we need to be mounting a defense of integration as an anti-racist project. I think there are many people who devoted their lives to the cause of integration who would be rolling in their graves to hear us say that this was necessary, and that the people that we would need to defend it from were liberals of all people, not sort of social conservatives. But yes, this is a problem. It's a problem that I have like put on the back burner many times because it doesn't seem as important as many of the other problems that are going on, right? And I want to emphasize that we should have some perspective here. This is not like the worst thing that's happening in the world, and it's not happening in every workplace in America or anything. But as to the question of cosmopolitan socialism, I think that our socialist movement should be very clear about what our principles are. So thank you for sharing that story. It disturbs me, but it's also not new to me. As having my partner does now, she actually now does teach mostly Black and brown children, and she is capable of teaching them math and reading without, in my opinion, hurting them. So, and she loves her students and her students love her. And I think it's good for everybody.
And I think David had a question. Is that right, David?
Yes, thanks so much. Yeah, I hope I can put my thoughts together quickly, but this topic is super relevant to me recently, this issue of like solidarity and commonality above sort of emphasizing differences and the kind of liberal models of accentuating those things. But I'm finding some awkwardness in my own life recently. Kind of like taking what makes sense to me theoretically, or like reading Michael's book, or reading Meagan, or there was a Michael's conversation with Dustin Guastella I guess last year was very influential to me as well. But like these things make sense to me kind of theoretically. I am in DSASF here, so I have some, it's not like I'm completely separated from politics, but I find that often where these things are coming to bear or being relevant to me are maybe in like liberal dominated contexts, and still contexts that are far from like a labor organizing thing where like a common interest is binding people together from different backgrounds. So it's more of like a, what I'm experiencing more is a kind of like distaste for liberal habits. So then when you try to express that, it very quickly becomes received as like you were saying, Megan, kind of smuggling in some kind of reactionary stance. And I even started to question myself, like, wait, am I just becoming, is this a kind of like, is that true? Am I just like being negative around things that are like actually people's hardships in their life that to them there is a frame that makes sense to them and connects to their own experience that I am rejecting, which is a kind of hurtful thing, and like not building solidarity. It's actually putting me on the outside of the frame that they have. So I hope that's organized enough. But like, yeah, like how do we bring this stuff to bear beyond the, if, yeah, I don't know. Does that make sense to you? Any comment there? Thank you.
Yeah, I think there's a difference between what we're clear about among ourselves, like with a certain degree of sort of understanding already as a baseline, and what we want to decide amongst ourselves is the truth. Like the truth is that like universalism is good, and actually it's something that early liberals got right, and then liberals sort of drifted away from. And it's not like early liberals got everything wrong. The main thing that they got wrong, they got a lot of right. They got a lot right. The idea that we should have democracy, for example, and the idea that like individual rights within a political system are important. I mean, these are good liberal values, and liberalism itself, because of its belief in free market capitalism, can never actually fulfill the promise of the best that it has to offer. And so I think that universalism is something that we take from the early liberal tradition, and then we basically say that only socialism can actually realize this promise. So the reason that I'm saying all of that is because I want us to think about what we decide is true amongst ourselves first, and then we have a whole separate can of worms, which is how do we articulate that to other people. And here I want to go back to the vampire's castle concept, because if you don't know what I'm talking about, that is good. I'm glad you're not like super plugged into the internet to the point where you like, are paying attention to stupid things that don't entirely matter. But the truth is that there are some people who agree with the substance of what we have articulated here, who have like an incredibly aggressive way of interacting with other people that actually mirrors the kind of like behavioral modes of the like wokes that they despise. And that's a phenomenon that didn't exist before, like about 2 years ago. It only more or less is confined to like Twitter. It's pretty marginal, but it's worth knowing about and thinking about for all of us, because if we agree with the baseline here, then we know that there are certain like ways of interacting with other people that we want to avoid. So I think it's best to be generally like respectful and cautious, because these things mean a lot to people. And even if people are like wrong about stuff, as long as they're not coming in bad faith, there's no reason to be like very harsh with people. I've found in my experience in DSA several occasions to open up a dialogue that lasts for several weeks or several months with somebody and like try to convince them of my perspective. It's worked sometimes, it hasn't worked other times, but it requires patience. I have also found, maybe I'm like being too candid or something. In my experience in DSA, I have found that there's a certain degree of like frontal conflict with this type of ideology that's not worth it. So like there are like high stakes situations where you like need to avert a disaster in your like political organizing, or let's say it's in your personal life, not in a political context. And then there are times when you just let it slide because look, it's hegemonic liberalism, it's everywhere. You don't go around being an asshole to people all the time. Nobody will trust you and nobody will want to listen to you. Don't fight every single instance of it. And I think it's best in general to try to like separate out in your mind people that you think are acting in good faith and people who you think are acting in bad faith. And the ones who are acting in good faith, I think it's important to try to like keep their respect, So I try to do that, and that means hopefully that they'll listen to me. For example, when like last summer's Black Lives Matter protests happen, and then I have like unique things to say about it that are cutting somewhat against the orthodoxies of liberal culture. Like I'm hoping that the people that I have not alienated will be available to listen to me and respect me enough to take what I'm saying seriously. And there were times earlier on, like let's say like 2017 or something, where I was just a little more like guns blazing on some of these questions, and I think that I made some enemies who I like regret making in a way. Like I'd rather it if those people would listen to me today, because I think we have a lot to figure out together. So I don't know if that's not a definitive answer to your question. It's certainly not advice. If anything, it's just me telling you that I like relate to that, and I think that there are two different aspects to this question, which is what do we believe to be true, and then how are we communicating that to other people in a way that's politically productive and constructive.
I think I'm probably
Totally.
gonna
Thank you.
re-listen to this. Sorry to cut you off, David. I also really relate to that question. I think Russell and then Mike had their hands up. Russell, if you want to go.
Oh yeah, sure. Just to comment on what you're talking about, especially related to the schooling. I think it's a reflection of the total lack of class politics in our society, because I think a lot of people, there's the cynical element of it where people kind of embrace that kind of strict identity politics because they don't want to undermine their own class position. But I think part of it is, I think the people who advocate that, as ridiculous as it may seem to people like us, I think often they're well-intentioned. But I think when you don't have a structural analysis, if you just look at race in isolation from other factors, it kind of makes sense what they're saying, right? So I think the issue is, I think the way to undermine that is doing the work to build an actual left that can make gains in ways that bring solidarity cross racial, Mm-hmm. And if you don't have that, I think people are going to look at it and say, well, you're just going to assess race in just a narrow way, and it leads to that logical conclusion that white people, they can't understand the Black kids, so they shouldn't be able to teach them, and so on. And you go down that road, and then once you embrace that premise, you end up in that direction, right? So I think it's just very important to build alternatives for people, and that's a lot of work. But I think if you build that, you can actually undermine that a lot, and I think a lot of people would be persuaded by that if you're able to build it.
Yeah, I agree with that. I feel like I may have overstated my case a little bit earlier, and I want to return to circle back on something and say that as appalled as I am by the story that Thomas told, and I genuinely am, the reason why it has traction is because the nexus of incredibly complex and very bad problems in our society often produce circumstances where, for example, a white teacher will overestimate the degree of threat that they're receiving from a young Black male student, and will, because we have hyper policed society and our school police call in police for disciplinary measures, and because we have an overeager criminal justice system, you see what I'm saying, there are real phenomena that are actually occurring that need to be addressed. It's just that Russell's right. I mean, this is a Band-Aid. The idea that, okay, well, we're just going to have only Black teachers teach only Black kids. We're essentially going to have all Black schools and all white schools, and that's going to solve the issue. It's not going to solve the issue. It's a Band-Aid on a gaping, bleeding head wound, right? And we need to take people's concerns seriously, and the stories that they tell of real things that have happened in their life seriously. And actually, instead of rejecting or dismissing, deepen. That's a difference in orientation. Instead of refuting, you make more profound with a deeper explanation. It requires a lot of patience, and not everybody's going to be receptive to you, which is why it's important to be a generally amiable and nice and pleasant person, because it will increase the likelihood that people that will actually listen to you when an issue like this comes up and requires you to provide a deeper explanation than people necessarily want to hear, right? There's a lot to be said for not being antisocial. I think that's a lesson that the left needs to learn.
Yeah, it's good for me to hear that. All right,
thank you,
Mike.
Meagan.
Oh, sorry, Jeremy. Did you want to say something?
No, just briefly. Sorry, Mike. just in agreement in terms of like searching for this tertiary approach, because so much of the culture war, quote unquote, is really kind of taking an oppositional position and trying to out logic or out debate the other side. And I really think the deepening approach as you were describing is just like a great daily practice. And like it's a practice. I don't know if there's a perfect way to do it, but it seems like a very healthy orientation. So yeah, just in agreement.
Here's an example of like an attempt that I made. It's easier when you're in person and people are like, as we discussed, the internet's a vampire's castle unto itself. So like it's easier when it's in person, but in my job requires me to like post articles on the internet. So I'm going to receive like some flack on occasion. But I wrote an article last summer when Black Lives Matter 2.0 was happening, where I used a study that had just come out to make the case that Black people, and specifically Black men, are disproportionately killed by police. And when you're trying to figure out which Black people are killed by police, it's not actually true that middle class people are as likely to be killed by police than working class Black people. And so do you see what I mean? There's no disregarding at all going on here. Like I'm accepting the basic premises actually, but am deepening to try to introduce a class analysis. And you know what? It didn't totally work. Like some people were really mad at me for doing that because they felt that it did disregard the premise of Black Lives Matter. But actually, I think and I hope that other people read it and it helped them understand the scope of the problems that we are facing better. And I also try to remind myself that most nice, kind, thoughtful people read articles and then don't ever do anything with them. They don't tweet them, they don't email people, right? So you end up getting, like, when you hear from people, you tend to hear from people who are angrier. So that's an example of like attempting to deepen rather than dismiss. I don't know if that's helpful to think about.
Great. Right. Yeah, thank you. Mike?
My question is actually for you, Jeremy. I was curious if any, like the integral community or other kind of newer communities that are focused on futures, if any of those groups exhibit aspects of what we talked about tonight in terms of cosmopolitan socialism, or if you've noticed like emerging ways to help understand the commonalities between us.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll just be brief about that, but I do think, and you've been looking at this too, Mike, in our Patreon group, like bioregionalism and commons and commoning practices, peer-to-peer theory, which is sort of tangential and related to commoning in the common studies. I think they're interested in finding these common grounds in terms of, okay, how do we actually rebuild genuine communities? What are healthy practices of localization that don't necessarily slide into conservatism, but are like mediating, right, between, let's say, more left-oriented, universal, and then also some more conservative-oriented demographics. So like being that mediator with the right principled left-oriented ethos, I think is good. And I think that's why Michael was interested in like the regenerative movement and commons practices and integral theory, because either they were talking about those kinds of universalisms or they were giving frameworks to start thinking and practicing our thinking in terms of holding those together. So that's just my 2 cents for this context. I don't know if you wanted to comment on that at all, Meagan.
No. I think I know very little about it, and it's really interesting to hear you talk about it. Before we hear from another person, I just remember that there was something I meant to bring up earlier, which I'll just throw in here, even though it's unrelated, or it's just related to everything we've been talking about. There's an anecdote that I was very moved to read in Against the Web. The anecdote about David McReynolds. Do you guys know what I'm talking about? You guys have been reading the book. So David McReynolds was he had been a member of the Socialist Party. He was a draft card burner and a war resistor. And this story that Michael tells is that McReynolds told him is that earlier, before the draft card burning in 1957, the Soviet Union launched the Sputnik satellite, and McReynolds was watching it in a bar in Greenwich Village, and he like runs out into the street because he's so excited from what he just saw. He turns to a person and he says, "We did it." The person says, "Did what?" He's like, we put an object in space that didn't come down. And the person says, you mean the Russians did it? And he's like, no, we, the human race, did that. And I think because communism is an ideology and doesn't function as an descriptive identity today, we maybe are forgetting the extent to which actually in the 20th century it functioned more similarly to a descriptive identity, even though it is an ideology. If you lived in a communist country, if you subscribed to even just progressive ideas in the United States, all the way from progressive to communist ideas in the United States, the level of vilification, dehumanization, and like otherization of you as a communist was very extreme. And so we can see the way that these kinds of scaffolds are functioning, right, to prevent us from seeing what we are capable of as a human race. It's like it's a milestone that the United States didn't get to appreciate, which is actually very sad when I think about all the Americans who did not get to appreciate the wonder and the glory of Sputnik arriving in space, because they were not able to see past the ascriptive identity that you're Russian, right? The Russians did that. The communists did that. And they couldn't see that we actually, the human race, had done that. I found that anecdote very moving, and I think that Michael included it for a reason, which is to help us think about what we're missing, right? Like what exactly we're missing. The kind of like collective spirit that we are missing out on when we indulge essentialism too much.
Yeah, I love that anecdote. Thank you for reminding me of it. So I think I'm just going to say, I think we have time for just a few more questions while we still have Meagan. So I'm going to say the next three people. Hopefully I say your name right. Is it Iran? First one was correct. And then we'll do Dory and Josh in that order.
Hi. So I'm curious about a contradiction in the liberal mindset, I guess, between like inclusivity and essentialism. And I think you were getting at this earlier. And I want to illustrate it with a well-known example. J.K. Rowling wrote the Harry Potter books with a very undiverse cast of characters. And this was fine to most people, I guess, at the time. But in recent years, it's come under fire, especially because she herself, going back and saying Dumbledore was gay, and then more recently she wrote a extension of the world using Native American imagery, and that came under fire. So it was interesting to me because people have been pushing JK. I mean, I'm just using her as an example, but people are often pushing artists in general, but to be more inclusive in the characters they write, and it's in the case of a single author, you really see that contradiction, because J.K. Rowling might in good faith, although I don't think she did, but let's say J.K. Rowling might in good faith aspire to write like a really accurate, sort of respectful portrayal of a particular culture in her own world that she invented, but people will still criticize that. The same liberal types will criticize that very strongly as not having been good enough, not having captured the experience in the way that the translators couldn't capture Amanda Gorman's experience. And so that kind of just reveals the game.
That's such a good like exercise to think about, because I think it captures that contradiction perfectly. Let me see if I can wrap my mind around it. I feel that, okay, so there are two sort of like finger waggings. Two fingers are wagging. One of them is saying like you need to have more diversity, and the other one is saying like you did a very bad job representing a culture that wasn't yours. If I had to choose which one I would prefer J.K. Rowling to listen to, I would prefer her to listen to the one saying more diversity. And that doesn't mean that I'm going to like the result of it, right? It doesn't mean that she's going to succeed on the terms of art. I mean, a successful work of art will be able to successfully understand the experience of another. And I don't just mean another when it comes to like ascriptive identities. I literally mean just like another person. Like you're writing fiction, you're sort of imagining the life of another person who doesn't exist. To be able to peer into the world of another person who isn't you is the task of a novelist. Now, they may not always succeed. I think that like I've not read that. I'm sure that it's like kind of bad. Like I'm sure that it's bad. I'm sure it's like kind of offensive. I think it's perfectly acceptable when somebody tries and fails to imagine the inner life of another person, a person who's different from them, including a person from a different culture, for us to say, you didn't do a very good job. At the end of the day, you failed spectacularly. And I feel like in the process of failing, you had reinforced these ideas, which I would prefer you to not have reinforced. So that's a version of like criticism that would be perfectly acceptable. But I wouldn't then tell J.K. Rowling, like, I can't believe you fucking tried to write about a culture that you don't even belong to. I actually think that we should leave the door open for people to write about cultures that they don't belong to. And we should encourage them to do a much better job than most people do, right? And that's just the function of criticism, is to just honestly respond and say, this did not work. This was a failure. I love that, by the way. I might use it. I might steal it from you. Just sort of like, and the bridge was like just randomly saying that Dumbledore was gay after the whole series was over.
Dory?
Yes. Sorry, I wanted to let Megan finish. Hi. So I was the one who joined late because of a daylight savings mix-up, because I live in Spain and we didn't change the time yet. So I will not comment on things that were said prior because I was not part of the first part of the discussion. I would like to comment on something that I kind of gathered from what other people said, and then if Megan and Jeremy want to add on, that would be perfect. So I guess I would like to suggest, if anyone heard about nonviolent communication as a tool to better basically learn kind of a new language of how to communicate better and how to assess ourselves, right? Like how do I feel now, and then to express it, and then to have empathy towards the other people around me if I'm in company. And then if there is any issue that I want to resolve, basically, right, in terms of conflicts between myself and other people or within a group, then how to do that in a non-alienating way, right? Which Meagan, you talked about a lot, but I was wondering if you knew that framework that gives it a name and helps to people to train in it, basically, right? And gain that experience of which is applicable for everyday situations, for ourselves and our friends, for ourselves and our family, and eventually with strangers that we would like to argue with, right? If we're wanting to advocate for any cause, whether it's political or less political in the sense of government related, right? And I would just give my short perspective that I'm coming from permaculture world and regenerative agriculture, and I saw this, for example, when we talked with Spanish farmers trying to sell them a regenerative agriculture model and getting a lot of pushback, because first, we're young people, so you're talking to a grown-up who's been doing it for decades, and his family has been doing it for decades, so what the hell do you know? And you're a foreigner, so what do you know about Spain or this specific region of Spain, right? The biome and the climate that I don't know. And you sound like a hippie, and I don't like this, so maybe you shouldn't tell me what to do, basically. And it was just about the communication, how to build a connection with them. And once they get to know you, and Spain specifically, and the rural part of Spain, and maybe it's similar in the United States, I'm not sure. It's a very like eye contact trust. Like if you're talking them with on like in email, on the phone, they might think, okay, maybe I'll listen, that's fine. But until you meet with them, they will not trust you. Like that's not going to happen. So I learned from specifically my experience. I was part of a project that once we got to meet them and work with them a little bit, and they felt like we had some kind of a bona fide of sorts, then they were very open to a lot of things, because they know that, especially, well, that's true for agriculture everywhere, that you need young people to come in and start small farms to provide food. And that's my focus. But through MR and TMBS, I started getting more into like understanding politics, because I'm not very well versed in in Spain. It's been really hard to try and get information, but I just mentioned nonviolent communication is a tool to communicate better, whatever it is that we want. Yeah. And as Meagan, as you said, to try not to alienate people, right? Not to be the, as another commentator said, the woke scold brigade, right? To just tell people what they're doing wrong all the time and just be unbearable, basically. Yeah. So, yeah, that's it.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you. I guess I'll add to that that somebody said in the chat that's a place where social media fails. Absolutely. I mean, the ability to present yourself as a living, breathing, and potentially likable human being, it's very hard on social media. And so people are very touchy when they're like, this is my experience. You don't know anything about my experience, back off. I don't think I've ever had that problem. I mean, I canvass for Bernie Sanders every single weekend from September to March. So like, that's a lot of canvassing, and that's not the only canvassing project that I've done. So I think that I have a lot of experience talking to people in my community. And I don't think that anyone has ever just straight up said, like, you don't know me, you don't know my struggles, you seem too different from me for us to even have this conversation. And by the way, fuck you for even trying, which is the kind of attitude that you see a lot on the internet. Because in person, I mean, I'm just right in front of you. I mean, you can choose to close the door if you like, if you don't want to talk to me. But you can sense our commonalities. We are literally sharing space. We are two bodies standing right in front of each other. It's a little harder to ignore that common ground when you're faced with the physical reality of it, right? And I like your point about eye contact. I mean, I think that just like looking people in the eye, and I mean this both literally and metaphorically, like taking the time to really look people in the eye and actually see them and like reveal yourself to be a person is critical for selling anybody on any argument. Now, we can't always do that on the internet. I wonder if there's a way to like metaphorically look people in the eye on the internet. This goes back to our question of like right practice when it comes to using social media. Maybe that's something to chew on. I've found that literally looking people in the eye openly and honestly is very important to persuading them in person. We can't do that on social media, but like, what are the things that we can do to show people that we see them as equals and to allow them to then in turn view us as people, not just like avatars of whatever social concept. So thank you for sharing that.
Meagan, do you have time for one last question?
Yeah,
okay,
for sure.
awesome. It's not Josh who's asking this question, but Josh is the name of seeing.
Hey, yeah, my name's Brittany.
Hi, Brittany.
Nice to meet you guys.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah, so not so much a question as just sort of a comment that actually I think might tie us together a little bit and even maybe transition into next month. But yeah, this concept that Meagan was talking about, as well as Dory and a few others have mentioned, about the essentialness of deepening relationships rather than disregarding people, I think is so important, but is also really extremely difficult. And I think one of the reasons I found Michael to be so compelling is because he made conversation and space for us on the left to embrace spirituality and faith and what that can mean for people and what an amazing tool it is. And just in hearing Lisha talk about this like conundrum of how can we be these people that deepen relationships when we're like constantly afflicted by mass violence and we're alienated and isolated, and there's so much conflict in what we see on social media, but also like experience in our daily lives. It's really difficult to do that, like have that patience and the long-term thinking and like being very present with people. And I think the tools that can be offered through like meditation and spirituality of how do we cultivate compassion and how can we like be in the present moment with other people and have compassion even when people are very frustrating or triggering or like really thinking in a different headspace with us. I think I love that that's something Michael stood for in sort of incorporating and showing us the values in those tools for our political project on the left. And yeah, I'm excited to talk about that next month as well.
That's beautiful. I'm glad you said that. And I wanted to, I've been thinking about that a lot recently. I have had the last few months of my life have been the hardest of my life because I've had a family tragedy. And I have like unlocked new doors to new chambers spiritually, like genuinely, not in ways that are like traditional or archetypally religious or anything, but have, been able because of the profound suffering that like I have felt and that my family has felt, I feel like I have been able to see suffering as like something outside me and something that we all have universal access to, if that makes sense. Like one aspect of our shared experience of people is that we all suffer. And it's almost like suffering is like water. Like we all take like big or small sips of it, if that makes sense. But it's something that, or like air, like it belongs to us all. And in fact, it's impossible to imagine mortality without imagining suffering, because everything that you believe in, everything that gives you meaning, and everything that you love is, you only have that meaning because your life is going to end because of mortality, right? Because and mortality is suffering. Like when someone, the knowledge of your own mortality causes suffering for you. And when people that you love die, you experience profound suffering. And it has given me a more humanist perspective. My own experience over the last few months has given me a more humanist perspective. And, you know, I feel like I'm like tailing Michael on this. Like, I feel like he's been there for a long time. I feel like he understands that like whatever differences we may, profound differences, the differences between people on this call, like we are not the same as like, agricultural peasants in Sumatra. Like there are profound differences between people on this planet, but there are things that we all have in common. One of those certainly is suffering. And because politics is fundamentally a conversation about suffering and how to lessen suffering, right? It is actually the province of us all. It is like the universal province. And so nobody should be told that they can't speak about more or less any subject in politics as far as I'm concerned, because politics is the discussion of how to alleviate suffering, and suffering is a universal experience. So that's my like ascension into a new level of understanding spiritually. And I think that I can feel Michael's presence with me as I start to work some of these questions out, because I think that they are far from alien to him.
Wow. It is such a pleasure to just like talk to you and follow your thought processes, Meagan. And I wish that Michael was not here and you had not had to experience the suffering you've gone through these past couple of months, and that you guys could have connected over this, because I know he was such a fan of and admirer of what you were putting out there, and it would have been so cool to see the two of you connect even deeper. I think we're losing Meagan at this point, but if everyone wants to hang on for a bit, we'll tell you about next month, Jeremy and I. So thank you so much, Meagan. Hopefully you can join us.
I want to say thank you. This is a really beautiful community that you guys have built. I mean, I can tell that everyone is coming here with like a great sort of like spirit of inquiry and like a lot of openness and attention. So I really appreciate all of you listening to me and giving me excellent things to think about that I'll be thinking about long after this conversation. So thanks a lot, everyone.
Thank you, Meagan.
Thank you, Meagan.
So next month we are going to be doing, and Brittany teased it a bit, but I think for most of you, we're going to be starting to look at Michael Pollan's How to Change Your Mind. And do not feel like you have to have even read one page of this book to join us on the first night. It is quite the volume. I think I've listened to it and I'm listening to it for a second time, but the first time it took me a very long time to get through it. And now I remember there's kind of a bit of a, like, it starts a little slow and then it gets really good. But every time I'm like, oh my God, this book. And then I get to a point where I'm like, oh, this is so great. But I just wanted to say, yeah, please don't feel any obligation to have read it. Joshua Kahn Russell is going to be joining us for the upcoming, I think it's April. Do you know the date? Did we pick a date? I think it's April
first Tuesday, right?
April 6th. Yes. So Josh will be with us on April 6th. And then I just wanted to, tell you all to definitely come and join us, and don't feel any obligation to have read How to Change Your Mind. Is there anything you want to say, Jeremy?
Thomas says, if you've done mushrooms, do you need to read it at all?
I think most people have done mushrooms before they've read it who have ended up reading it. I would guess that's about 90% of the audience. I think pollen is maybe the outlier here. It is very different than doing mushrooms, reading this book. That's all I can say.
Martin says this part of the homework is doing mushrooms, or whatever you want.
Yeah, that's super optional. I mean,
yeah.
that's up to you. Again,
Yeah.
there's no obligation to do mushrooms or LSD before joining us on the 6th, but if that's how you would like to prepare for the group, by all means, that is your journey.
It may be preferable not to be on mushrooms or LSD
Yes.
during the Zoom call, just so you can participate better. But
and was there any other questions or comments anyone wanted to make before we hopped off? I know.
I had one.
Oh yeah, please.
Yeah, and I don't know if this is even going to generate too much discussion. I hope it might, but I wanted to talk about like one of my favorite lines, definitely one of the more provocative ones from Against the Web. And it's from the last chapter. Want to have a traditional family and take your 7 kids to a traditional church? Go for it. Want to live in a trisexual compound and practice Wiccanism? Do that. Who can even tell me like what a trisexual compound is? So I've turned that over a little bit and like it's kind of going in 2 directions, like outside of what most people really envision as what they want in their life. Like the very traditional and the very non-traditional, maybe. I don't know. I just had to highlight that. I wanted to throw it in there and see what other people had to say.
I'm going to say one quick thing just because this was sort of a version of example or whatever that Mike would use a lot. Like he would always be like some version of this, like a poly trans community versus like a Southern Baptist family. I think that was his way of kind of shorthand for just cutting to the fact that like we will probably never be able to get everyone to agree on like how things should be or how the world can run, but perhaps there can become a sense of like everyone deserves shelter, healthcare, food, and dignity. And that can be like at the core of how humanity works. But like, yes, the Southern Baptist or whatever, I forget which religious, maybe he just said, religious family, will probably like never necessarily agree in the trisexual, like I can't remember exactly the number he threw out there, like in the way they're living. But if we can just get to the point where humans can just respect one another's base existence and like how they should be treated as a human just because they're human, that was the goal.
Yeah, that was kind of Luke's point, I think, in the last session too, about liberalism and some of the good things about the project of liberalism that socialism can fulfill, which is allowing for that kind of broad, like, okay, if you want to have that kind of community over there, you can go do that, but there's a baseline, like Lisha was saying, that everybody gets as being part of the society. And that kind of undercuts the cultural polarization between living a more progressive life and then also a community that might not live that kind of or have those kinds of values. So there's something about that undercuts the cultural polarization. That's coming up a lot. I heard that from Meagan too today, just about like focusing on labor, and then Mike's question earlier about how do practices like commoning and regenerative culture also kind of undercut the kind of cultural polarization, which is sort of at the top. And there's this deeper structure that we really need to be working on somehow. So anyway.
Yeah. And it kind of connects to what Doria was saying about nonviolent communication as well. Like how to just make eye contact and like have clarity. Some people wrote into me and I asked folks who had kind of gotten into the IDW or alt-right media and then found Michael and got pulled away from that reactionary, rabbit hole. And a few people said that Michael just spoke really clearly and in a way that they just found to be really, it just sounded true. It was like, it was even just again, I was thinking what Dory's comment, like there was something in his communication style that made his set of politics, which, as Meagan was kind of saying, like, morally righteous, because that is what is moral, correct sounding.
I just wanted to say the link I dropped in chat was a piece written by Brent Cooper, and it talks about Michael's book and the IDW, fall of fascism, and the call for cosmo-socialism. And I had read that earlier today, and I was like, felt like it brought together a lot of stuff from our last meeting, and also kind of prepared my mind a bit for this as well.
Thanks, Mike. That's a great piece. Thanks for reminding me about that. I totally blanked out on Brent's review. We republished that over at Liminal back when that was a little project. So yeah, I recommend that. Everybody, please do read Brent's review.
Well, thank you all for joining us. Hopefully you can come back next time. Unfortunately, I saw in the chat someone asked if there was a discount for psilocybin, and TMBS does not have a code yet, but if we get one, we will post it to our socials. Yeah, appreciate all of you. So many of you asked questions. I've been grappling with myself, so it's always nice to not feel like you're the only one in a corner trying to figure out how to communicate with one of your friends' libertarian fiancés or whatever your plight is. It can feel really isolating. So appreciate all of you taking the time and sharing so thoughtfully.
Yeah, thanks everybody. I'm learning so much from everyone's questions and commentary, and Meagan was brilliant. Like Lisha, like you said, I'm gonna have to re-listen to this one and take a lot of notes.
Yeah.
So yeah, just super grateful. So thank you all.
And if anyone has ideas or feedback about how our book groups are structured, or things they'd be excited to talk about or focus it on, please message Jeremy or I. All right. Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Have a good night. Bye.